Yeah, that's a fair question. First of all, Paul did not teach that Jews have to observe the Torah in the letter. I'll tell you why. In 1 Corinthians 9:20, Paul said, I, Paul, am not under the Torah. That is absolutely definitive. I, Paul, who is a Jewish Christian, am not under the Torah. So that proves where Paul stands. When he says, I haven't taught anything against the law of the Jews, I think he's being subtle there. Paul knew perfectly well that the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, predicted the Messiah. And so he's not contradicting the Old Testament either. Granted that the Jews didn't understand that yet, but Paul did. So he's not against the Old Testament, which predicts the Messiah coming. But it would be sheer contradiction to say that Paul was observing the Torah, because that's the opposite of what he said in 1 Corinthians 9:20. The other point is in Galatians 5, where Paul says, if I still preach circumcision, verse 11 there, why am I still being persecuted? That shows he wasn't preaching circumcision. Well, please note that circumcision was required for Jews and Gentiles under the Torah, both. Paul obviously is not preaching circumcision because he says, why am I still being persecuted?
So you're saying that the council and then Paul contravened the commandment that was established by God under the Torah? This is what brought on the council. Verse 1, men came down from Judea,
yes,
and began to teach, unless you are circumcised according to the custom prescribed by Moses, who is God's shaliach, agent,
yes,
right, lawgiver, you cannot be saved.
That's right.
Right, because you're in disobedience. So
Of
you're
course.
saying that is contravened here. That is done away with at the council.
Of course it is, under the new covenant, because the new covenant is not a repeat of the old. That's in Galatians. The clearest passage of all is Galatians 3:19-29, where Paul clearly says there, what about the law now? Let's talk about the law. It was added 325 years later than the Abrahamic covenant. It was put into effect through angels. We're talking about the Mosaic law by means of a mediator. And then he said it was there until Christ came. In other words, under the Old Testament provision, the law then was our guardian until Christ, so that we could be justified by faith. It's perfectly clear to me there that the line of demarcation is the coming of Christ. The law of Moses in the letter is no longer the law for us in the new covenant.
Again, I go back to Acts 15. Unless you are circumcised, according to the custom commanded or prescribed by Moses, you cannot be saved. Was that statement correct?
Under the new covenant, absolutely not.
Right, but under old covenant, that statement is correct, right?
Of course it's correct. You cannot be part of the covenant, Jew or Gentile, but that's whole covenant there is what we are not dealing with now. So these false teachers were trying to pit the Old Testament against the New. And so what they decided, the council, was no, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised.
Well, according to the old
yes,
covenant law of Moses,
yes,
commanded, prescribed by Moses, they were right, but now they have
absolutely
become false. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, because James and Paul knew that they weren't under that same covenant. I think that Paul went even further and said that nobody has to be circumcised. I'm only suggesting that Paul himself is quite clear that he, Paul, who's a Jew, was not under the Torah. If you don't dig your heels in on that one, you get nowhere here. Paul is a Jew. Paul said in Romans 14, I'm convinced that nothing is unclean of itself. All things are clean. That's not supporting Moses. And Paul's a Jew. Of course, we could then go on to say that Jesus himself, as the Messiah, as the preacher of Christianity, had already said that. In the Gospels, Jesus abolished the food laws. Was that contrary to the Old Testament law? Of course it was. So Jesus begins to introduce the new covenant. He contradicts the law of divorce on one point. That's wonderful. He actually brings the law back to Genesis and says that Moses was wrong. Moses allowed you a divorce for a certain reason, doesn't matter what it was now. But that's only a concession to the hardness of your hearts. So there's Jesus promoting a new system. And Paul then takes it one stage further and makes it even clearer, I think. I don't say this is very easy, but if you don't start with 1 Corinthians 5:20, then you're in bad shape. And Peter was weak here. You know, Peter understood this, but when the pressure was on, he started separating from Jewish believers. It's the Jewish heresy that keeps coming back and is still with us today. I'm simply saying that Paul did not observe the Torah in the letter, and Paul was a Jew.